loud and clear.
From the studios of Radio Sputnik in downtown Washington, D.C., it's loud and clear. We take you inside the news 5 days a week. It's happening, and it's happening now. I'm Brian Becker. Over a dozen people have been arrested in connection with the assassination of the Russian ambassador in Turkey. Who was the assassin? Was he linked to al-Qaeda in Syria? And how, if at all, did the assassination impact the summit meeting between Russia, Turkey, and Iran regarding the Syria war? The race for the next chair of the Democratic National Committee is in full swing, and all indications are that the Democrats refuse to learn the lesson of Hillary Clinton's humiliating defeat. Egypt's Interior Ministry has arrested 5 people for fabricating images that would be passed off as scenes of suffering in Aleppo on social media. Fake news, fake images, and a false narrative from the U.S. government and mainstream media and some social media constitute a toxic mix for war propaganda. But first, we turn to the latest on the assassination of the Russian ambassador to Turkey. We are joined by independent journalist and political analyst Ben Norton. Welcome back, Ben.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining. The summit that took place in Moscow was important. The killing of the Russian ambassador certainly was a shocking event. And again, it happened on the eve of the summit. There are indications that the assassin was, in fact, a jihadist. He was chanting about Aleppo. He was reciting a poem, a rant that was very familiar to al-Nusra. There was an earlier statement from al-Nusra. I don't know if it's been completely verified that he was working with them. What do you think about all that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is an important thing that's not been analyzed too thoroughly yet. And actually, Max Blumenthal and Ken Klippenstein, 2 reporters writing in Alternate this week, published an interesting article in which they discuss how Erdogan has, like always, tried to blame the attack on Gulen. Gulen is a former Islamist politician with whom he had close ties, over which they had a falling out several years ago and has since become his arch enemy. But there is, of course, as always, almost no evidence that Gulen was in any way involved. In fact, Gulen has, although he has his own issues, has actually been critical of Erdogan's policy in Turkey of supporting Islamist rebels and, from the very beginning, arming the opposition. But rather, Ken Klippenstein and Max Blumenthal interviewed a man by the name of Ahmet Yayla, who's a former high-ranking member of Turkish law enforcement. And, this is someone who oversaw counterterrorism, and he was part of the chief of police in a border city between Turkey and Syria. And he discussed in the article in Alternate about how for years the Erdogan administration has been filling the law enforcement ranks with extremists. And if anything, the killer, the young Turkish policeman who killed Russia's ambassador, is actually probably an AKP loyalist. That is the right-wing Islamist party of which Erdogan is the leader. So, I mean, there's still a lot of analysis going on now, but I think it's very likely that not only when you look at his statements, but when you look at this young officer's past history, there are photos of him on social media, with other prominent politicians. There's a photo of him in front of an AKP flag. It's very likely that he was definitely motivated by, these extreme views. And Erdogan himself probably bears a responsibility for his Syria policy. There's been no shortage of propaganda that's been spread about Syria. And Erdogan, who's been shutting down opposition newspapers, dozens of them for months now, controls the narrative about what has been happening in Syria. And he's deeply invested. He spent many millions and millions of dollars supporting rebels with weapons and other munitions, and playing a kind of double game and supporting extremist groups, not only Jabhat al-Nusra, formerly known as Jabhat al-Nusra, the rebranded al-Qaeda affiliate, but also even ISIS. For many years, actually, Turkey was allowing people to cross its border and to join ISIS. Erdogan was also kind of playing a double game in the north, where ISIS was fighting Kurds, and Turkey would attack the Kurds in a kind of de facto alliance with ISIS. So if you look at all these clues, the chances are very likely that that this assassin, this murderer who killed an ambassador, which is, a horrific crime, was very likely an extremist himself who was motivated by, this very hardline Islamism that we've seen in the war in Syria, and that has been growing for quite some years now, troublingly, in Turkey, which, for all its problems, is technically a democracy, but that democracy has been dwindling and dwindling under Erdogan.
We're speaking with Ben Norton, political analyst and commentator, about the killing of the Russian ambassador, Andrei Karlov, in Ankara, where the assassin, Ben, because I still want to spend a little bit more time before we go into the broader sort of geostrategic implications of what's going on. The shooter, the killer, he shot the ambassador, I believe, 11 times. It was such an odd thing to watch that video where he's standing right behind him, appearing to be part of his security detail. Of course, the diplomatic corps of any country is not allowed, except on their own compound, on their own consulate or embassy, to carry weapons. No country allows a foreign country to carry arms in its country, and so each country is required by covenant to guarantee the security of the diplomatic corps. But he's right behind him, and then he shoots him 11 times. And afterwards, he started a rant when he had the stage all by himself, and it was a well-known Al-Qaeda nasheed or poem. It can be translated as, "We are the ones who obey the call of jihad." Now, it's interesting because if, in fact, the shooter is not a Gulen sympathizer, if he's part of or affiliated with al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda, and there's the rebranding that's been going on, and the United States government has labeled Al-Qaeda for the past 16 years as an existential terror threat, we have this odd thing where some parts of the U.S. military and political establishment have also been open or pretty open about the fact that the Syrian so-called moderate rebels couldn't separate themselves from armed units of Al-Qaeda or al-Nusra or the Army of Conquest. They're all pretty much the same. And David Petraeus, even the former commander of U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, according to the Jerusalem Post, had been quietly urging U.S. officials to consider aligning with so-called moderate members of Nusra Front in Syria. Four sources familiar with conversations, including one person who spoke to Petraeus directly. Petraeus reportedly advocates, quote, trying to cleave off less extreme Nusra fighters who are battling ISIS in Syria, but who joined with Nusra because they had the shared goal of overthrowing Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Now, that was also the shared goal of President Obama. He was explicit about it. It was the shared goal of John Kerry earlier. It was the shared goal, certainly, of Hillary Clinton. So we have this interesting dynamic that there are good terrorists and then there are bad terrorists, and sometimes the good terrorists and the bad terrorists are the same people.
Absolutely. And when you also bring in John Kerry, there was an interesting article in the Washington Post last week which openly acknowledged that the CIA has been, this is the word the Washington Post used, shielding Al-Qaeda in Syria from Russian and Syrian government attacks. So clearly there is an alliance of interest here, which is in many ways reminiscent of the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And for those who don't know, I mean, this is a brutal war in the 1980s in Afghanistan where the U.S. and its allies, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, through the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence agency, were supporting the Mujahideen, these hardline extremist Islamist rebels who were the ancestors of what we now know today as the Taliban in Afghanistan, and then, of course, Al-Qaeda throughout the world today. And yeah, I mean, going to the war in Syria, the parallels are absolutely striking. And, as you mentioned, there's, of course, it's important to recognize that the deep state is not entirely unified on this policy. In fact, the Pentagon is much more critical, and the Pentagon is actually arming Kurdish forces, which are fighting Islamist forces backed by the State Department. But overall, it's true that when it comes to the White House and when it comes to major parts of the CIA and the State Department, it's clear that they have decided that they've done the so-called deal with the devil, and they're aligned with hardline extremist Islamist groups, many of which are openly allied with Al-Qaeda. But at the same time, the U.S. is claiming that it's at war with Al-Qaeda. So it's an absolutely contradictory policy. But when it comes to Turkey and when it comes to this killing, the shooter did not need to be part of al-Nusra. I mean, it's true that, as you mentioned, that he was reciting al-Nusra propaganda. It's unlikely that, of course, he was a member of the actual group. Otherwise, he'd be in Syria. But in Turkey, there's a lot of sympathy for these extremist groups, thanks to the policy of the Erdogan administration. And in fact, speaking of Jabhat al-Nusra, in August, Erdogan was interviewed actually by a Russian publication in which he admitted that he did not think that al-Nusra should be considered a terrorist organization because it was supposedly fighting ISIS. And it's true, there have been skirmishes between ISIS and al-Nusra. But if you listen to interviews with al-Nusra leaders, it's not because they are politically opposed to ISIS. And in fact, in many ways, they're ideologically very similar. It's simply because ISIS is such an extreme, hyper-partisan organization that it attacks anyone who's, not part of it. So ISIS has attacked al-Nusra, and reluctantly, al-Nusra has had to fight in return.
Ben Norton, let me just jump here because we have 5 minutes left. Time goes so fast. And I want to ask you about the summit that took place the day after the assassination of the Russian ambassador. There was a joint declaration issued by Iran, Russia, and Turkey. This is it seems to me, a major realignment because, of course, Turkey is the eastern flank of NATO. NATO is a U.S.-led military alliance. Turkey, as you've been pointing out, was facilitating the flow of fighters and funds and arms and weapons to ISIS, to al-Nusra. Without that support from Turkey, the armed opposition, certainly would not have been where it is today or where it's been in the last 5 years. In other words, greatly strengthened as a consequence. But now you have Iran, Russia, and Turkey together, quote, and this is from the joint declaration, express their readiness to facilitate and become the guarantors of the prospective agreement being negotiated between the Syrian government and the opposition. They invited all other countries with the influence on the situation on the ground to do the same. This is that's the language from the joint declaration. They strongly believe that this agreement, meaning their agreement, will be instrumental to create the necessary momentum for the resumption of the political process in Syria in accordance with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254. If enacted, and if Turkey stays true to it, that would mean a major shift. In other words, not insisting that Assad must go, but trying to come up with some sort of new joint resolution. And most interesting about this process is this time the United States is excluded. Kerry was not invited. That's pretty big because it seems to me to be the final denouement, the catastrophic ending of Obama's policy in Syria. Go ahead.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there. And just to emphasize this, it is absolutely extraordinary that Russia, Iran, and Turkey, which had previously been at loggerheads, had been enemies, met without the U.S. to discuss Syria. I mean, this is an unprecedented development. And I think it just demonstrates how rapidly and how dramatically Turkey has been shifting its Syria policy. And I think this actually began, it didn't just begin a few months ago with the fall of Aleppo. It actually began, I would argue, earlier in the year, perhaps even in late 2015. And that began when Turkey's policy in Syria completely backfired and ISIS began carrying out attacks internally inside Turkey. Because before, as I discussed earlier, there was a kind of policy in which Erdogan kind of indirectly supported ISIS as an ally against both Assad, but also against the Kurds. But the thing was, Turkey was also allowing the U.S. to use its Incirlik air base to carry out attacks against ISIS. And of course, Turkey can't be allied with ISIS and against ISIS at the same time and help the U.S. bomb ISIS. So ISIS began carrying out attacks in revenge. And since then, Turkey has taken a more hardline position against ISIS, although, when it intervened several months ago in the middle of this year in Syria without the approval of the Syrian government, Turkey said that it was going to be waging a war against ISIS, although it mostly waged a war against Kurds. And that intervention has continued since. But I do think that since Turkey has directly intervened and it has now not only, indirect, but direct forces involved in the war, that it's very likely that Erdogan is going to want to leave with something. It's important to understand that since 2011, when protests began and they were militarized and there was an influx of weapons and foreign fighters, Turkey has been very heavily invested in what has been happening in Syria. I mean, not only is it a crucial ally next to it, but it is actually, invested a lot of its resources and money in this war. And I think Erdogan made the decision to jump ship to the winning side. And he said, I might have been on the wrong side for quite some years now, but I'm going to make sure that I can get out of this with something. And I think it's hard to tell what they agreed on. You read the press release from their meeting. Of course, most of the deliberation happened behind closed doors. But I think we're actually going to see some kind of agreement reached about northern Syria. There's been some reporting that Turkey has been building some apartment buildings and other buildings in northern Syria because Turkey has about 3 million refugees from Syria now. They actually have more refugees than any other country. And it's likely that they're going to build some apartment buildings and such to send many of those refugees back into northern Syria. But the question is Turkey going to maintain unofficial control or official control over that land? It's hard to tell, but it's important to also recognize that not only did this conference happen, the rhetoric of the Turkish government itself has been changing. In fact, just this week, the Foreign Minister Cavusoglu called on other foreign governments to halt aid and foreign support for group foreign fighters in Syria. So I think it's very likely that as the war wraps up here, and it's going to wrap up pretty soon, I believe, with the recapture of Aleppo, I think Turkey is jumping ship to the side of the winners, and in a kind of opportunist way is just going to try to get whatever it can.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. We've been speaking with Ben Norton. He is a political analyst, a political commentator. Thank you, Ben Norton. You are listening to Loud and Clear. We'll be back.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
You are listening to Loud and Clear. I'm Brian Becker. The race for the next chairperson of the Democratic National Committee is in full swing, and all indications are that the Democrats refuse to learn the lesson of Hillary Clinton's humiliating defeat. We are joined by Ted Rall, editorial cartoonist and columnist. Welcome back, Ted.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you for joining. 5 candidates are vying to become the next chair of the DNC. What's important about this race, and does it reflect deep divisions politically within the party, or is it more about cosmetic presentation? Even after such an embarrassing loss in the presidential election, it's hard for me to imagine the Democrats really becoming defenders of poor and working people, 1, and 2, actually analyzing why it is that they lost in 2016 against a candidate so unpopular, the most unpopular candidate ever, Donald Trump.
Yes, well, it is hard to believe that you're going to see a change in the leadership. And certainly early indications are that we're not going to see something as interesting as a return of Howard Dean, who, it's interesting. Howard Dean did this job before, and he inaugurated something called the 50-state strategy, which basically acknowledges that there are 50 states. No mention about Guam and other territories, and that in this day and age, you want to campaign everywhere, something that Donald Trump learned and taught us, that it's not about who's in the room, it's about who's watching on television. But anyway, so if I were a Democrat, I were voting for this position, I'd probably go for Dean. But he's probably not going to win. You're going to see, after the departure of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, you are just going to see a return to the same old, same old. And I think the tea leaf that I read the most into was the re-election of Nancy Pelosi as the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives. To me, the Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid school of centrist Democratic Leadership Council inspired style of new way, third way, whatever you want to call it, Clinton Democrat seems to be just doomed to continue. And it is a little startling. You would expect that after what just happened, there would be a desire to take the party in a different direction. But the problem is that the people who would make that change are the people who are responsible for the defeat, and they're not going to vote against themselves.
The Democrats are blaming Russia for their loss, and James Comey, the FBI director, for having said that the investigation of Clinton's emails would be reopened about 10 days before the election after the FBI had seized the computer of Huma Abedin, who is the wife or ex-wife of Anthony Weiner. They blame Comey for having said it's going to reopen, or the Russians, who they say, and even Vladimir Putin personally directed the email hacks of the Democratic Party to embarrass them and to throw the election to Donald Trump. Now, of course, Hillary Clinton won the election. I mean, she won the election by almost 3 million votes. It's not close. It's several percentage points or a couple of percentage points. She did lose the battleground states of Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin by about 12,000 votes. It seems unlikely to me that the workers who, or middle-class people or poor people who either didn't vote in Wisconsin and Michigan or who voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012 and this time voted for Trump, that they were really caring that much about Russia. I think they were caring more about jobs, and Clinton didn't try to address them. But Bernie Sanders did address them. That was what his campaign was all about, working class people against the big banks, against Wall Street. And I believe that if Sanders had won the election, had won the nomination, he would have won the election. He would have crushed Donald Trump in these battleground states. Now, you would think then that the Bernie Sanders supported Keith Ellison, who is a U.S. representative, a Muslim from Minnesota since 2007, that the Democratic Party would actually start to think like, hey, you know what? Maybe we should just do that. We should move in the direction of Bernie Sanders. But it seems like all the Democratic Party bigwigs, including President Obama, are going in an opposite direction.
Yeah, that's actually right. Keith Ellison does have the strong support of Bernie Sanders and that whole wing of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in this fight. But no, they are not. It seems he's at this point, I would say he's unlikely to get that position. And it's a little mind-boggling, because I agree with you in your analysis that Sanders would have trounced Trump. And I think it's important to realize, to just reiterate that although Hillary is currently about 2.7 million votes ahead of Donald Trump in the popular vote, it's still a devastating defeat for her, because given all the weaknesses of Trump as a candidate and as a human being, she should have been able to have trounced him. The blankety-blank grabbing video by itself should have put a complete end to his candidacy. It was one after another in a list of forced errors. I have, as a parlor game, tried to list all the major mistakes she committed in the campaign, and there's just scores of them. It's one after another, missed opportunities. And I mean, the minimum wage thing is an example. I mean, Bernie wanted $15 an hour. It's currently $7 and change. So what does Hillary do? She goes back to the 1990s incrementalist Dick Morris approach and says, oh, let's split the difference and say we want 12. And, what's the point of that? You have the people on the far right are opposed to the minimum wage at all. They would like it to be zero. And so you're not going to get them as a result of asking for less. You're not even matching Bernie. And then so you don't get his people. And, and forget about being really ambitious and saying, hey, it should be 23 or 24, because that's what it would be if it had kept up with inflation since the end of the Vietnam War. And I think the Democratic Party doesn't even know its own membership, really. They don't really, in the same way that in a sense the Republicans only learned that their party had changed from Donald Trump's capture of the nomination, the Democratic Party learned that their party had changed by how successful Bernie Sanders was, coming from 2% recognition among Democratic voters to polling 47% of the vote in the primaries against strident opposition from within the campaign, from within the DNC, and rule blockings and all sorts of nefariousness that came out in WikiLeaks. The Democrats haven't absorbed the lesson. The Republicans have. They've pivoted. Figures like Reince Priebus, the RNC chair, have embraced Trump. You just don't see the same kind of come to Jesus moment on the Democratic side. It's a little baffling.
Bernie Sanders said this about Keith Ellison, at a time when the Republicans will control the White House, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the U.S. Senate, and two-thirds of all the state houses. That's all the governors and state assemblies around the country, and they have a lot of influence. It is time for a fundamental rethinking about what the Democratic Party stands for and how it functions. It's time for the Democratic Party to make it clear that we will become a grassroots party which stands with the working families of this country, and we will fight for a government that works for all of us, not just the 1%. That's the kind of change Keith Ellison represents and why he must become the next chair of the Democratic Party. Now, I think that's completely utopian on Bernie Sanders' part. The idea that the Democratic Party, which is a party of Wall Street and a party of the military-industrial complex, a party of the plutocrats. Yes, it sounded a little liberal over the years compared to the very right-wing Republican Party, will suddenly become a grassroots party if Keith Ellison, for instance, or other similar people become the leadership of the Democratic Party. If it were to become a grassroots party, the Washington consensus would be to just dump that party. I just think this is complete naivete, and he's selling people a bill of goods on this one.
Well, yeah, you're right. And the reason, and we don't even have to speculate on that because, I mentioned Howard Dean. He's been DNC chair before. Howard Dean is of what he called from the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. And yet, even though he got to do the job, it didn't change the party overall because that Wall Street money is going to speak a lot louder than even Keith Ellison if he wins this position. It's not going to make any difference. He's not going to be in charge of the party. He's not going to be the party boss. He's just going to be an administrator until they find someone else.
Keith Ellison is now under attack for a lot of different things from the Democratic Party establishment. President Obama, by the way, just to diverge for a second, when he was giving his end-of-the-year speech in his last 2016 press conference, he made a big point about pushing Thomas Perez, the United States Secretary of Labor since 2013. He said he was the best Secretary of Labor ever or something like that. And he said, well, and there are other nice people running for the chairperson of the Democratic National Committee, but clearly tilting against Ellison. What about Perez? Who is he?
Perez represents the centrist, the center-right part of the party, and that's why Obama's backing him. Obama, people forget, was once a member of the DLC, which exists no more, but still, nevertheless.
DLC for the audience. Go ahead. Democratic Leadership Council. They
were the Clinton. They represented the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, and they closed up shop a number of years ago. But the DLC was the soul of the post-Watergate, post-Jimmy Carter Democratic Party. And they've been pushing the party. They're the reason that the party has been moved so far to the right. Perez comes from that field, from that place. We wouldn't be looking for any serious change, even if a party chair were able to do it, to enact that kind of change. I don't think you'd find it from him at all.
The people who are in the Democratic Party, who have been loyal to the Democratic Party, whether they were in the Bernie Sanders wing or Hillary Clinton supporters or others, the basic argument was, we Hillary Clinton supporters and Hillary Clinton herself is the only thing that stands between you and the apocalypse. And the apocalypse, of course, was Donald Trump. Well, the apocalypse has arrived. The Democratic Party, though, isn't treating Donald Trump really as an apocalypse. Maybe they're trying to raise money off of his campaign. Some of the threatening positions that Trump represents, both on the environment or women's rights or Muslims or immigrants. But they're actually saying we want Donald Trump to succeed. President Obama is saying that. Michelle Obama is saying that. They're saying that if Trump succeeds, the country succeeds. It seems to me like a repeat performance whereby whenever the Democrats or the liberals or the centrists like Obama win and the right wing goes to town against him, whacking him, calling him a communist, calling him a socialist, even when he adopted a Republican health care plan, which we now know is the Affordable Health Care Act. The instinct of these people is to reach back to the more conservative right-wing Republicans, while the Republicans' instinct is to just kick them in the teeth.
Yeah, that's correct. When Republicans are in the minority, as we saw in 2009, they become the party of no, obstructionist in terms of legislation and in terms of presidential appointments. But when Democrats are in the same position as they are now, they make a lot of noise about going along with let the Republicans have their way. That what we hear on the left is from Democratic leaders is like, let the Republicans have their way. They'll hang themselves. Never mind that they're hanging themselves along with Democratic votes, without which, in many cases, their initiatives couldn't pass. For example, the invasion of Iraq. And the instinct for the Democrats is always to kowtow to the Republicans no matter what. And when they're in power, they reach across the aisle and they try to water down their initiatives, and they say, well, we have to be the president of a whole country. But look at Donald Trump. He comes in and appoints a radical right series of cabinet appointees and White House staffers that are breathtaking in their extremism, even for those of us who thought that he was a nut all along. I expected more of a grab bag there. Even there might even be the occasional Democrat or even a lefty mixed in there, but even fascist regimes drew from socialist parties sometimes. With the right, there is no compromise.
Ted Rall, I want to go back to Thomas Perez again, who is clearly Obama's choice for being the next head of the DNC. Again, I think it's just amazing because Perez was a big supporter of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Again, you had Donald Trump demagogically appealing to workers in hollowed-out industrial communities whose jobs have been lost, whose factories have closed. They haven't closed. They just went somewhere else where they could pay, the bosses could pay the workers $3 an hour instead of $15 an hour. He was able to go in and say to these people, it's because of trade, it's because of China, it's because of Mexico that you lost your jobs or your wages are low. So now Obama, after the election, where there should be like an autopsy, as the Republicans said they performed after their losses in 2008 and 2012 of the Democratic Party to see, well, what killed this corpse, what brought it down. Instead, he's promoting Thomas Perez to be the leader of the Democratic Party, and he's the supporter of TPP. That's astounding to me.
Yeah, it is a little astounding. I mean, I guess you could say that if you wanted to give the devil his due, that, Secretary Perez was a guy who he attempted a little bit of progressive regulation when he was part of the Obama administration. For example, he tried to push through a rule that would require anti-unionization activity to be publicized among publicly traded businesses. He attempted to double the maximum salary whenever overtime is required. But all the things that he tried were incrementalist and for the most part failed. He wasn't a very effective guy. So you could say, well, here's a guy very much like Obama whose heart may arguably be in the right place, but wasn't able to effectively bring home the bacon for American workers. And then, of course, obviously, you can't really support bad trade deals like the TPP and claim that you're pro-worker.
All right, we're going to be picking up this subject, Ted Rall, later. Ted Rall has been our guest. He is an editorial cartoonist. You can see his work at gocomics.com/Ted Rall. I urge you to do that. Great cartoonist and great political commentator as well. You are listening to Loud and Clear. We'll be back.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
You are listening to Loud and Clear. I'm Brian Becker. Egypt's Interior Ministry has arrested 5 people for fabricating images that would be passed off as scenes of suffering in Aleppo. In other words, images that were being produced inside of Egypt. In Syria's 5.5-year war, it's far from the only incident of images being produced or manipulated to mold public opinion. We are joined from London by Alexander Mercouris. He is the editor-in-chief of the Duran. Welcome back, Alexander.
Hello.
Let's talk about the arrests in Egypt. Is it shocking to think that someone was producing images that could very well have been distributed across social media and news agencies showing suffering children in Aleppo? And it turns out they were actually just actors.
Well, it's not shocking that people were doing it, but it is very shocking that things like that are distributed and reported in the media, the mainstream media, as if they are true, without any sort of critical understanding that that sort of thing is happening. And because there is this huge market for this kind of material, I'm afraid where there is demand, there is supply. And we have an example here of supply. Very corrupt, very wrong, but not surprising, and for me, in the end, not shocking.
The Egyptian Interior Ministry said that the residents of Port Said, a city on the Suez Canal, were caught in the middle of their shooting of a 12-year-old star, she was posing for 21-year-old Mustafa, who told the authorities that, quote, he normally photographed weddings and ceremonies, but had another idea in mind. In a conversation with them, the suspects revealed that they had shot a series of scenes to be spread on social media as actual pictures from Aleppo. This is according to the Egyptian government, which then were posted as videos and posted online. I mean, it's really, we've heard a lot about fake news in the United States because all of the attributions of fake news are purportedly by Russian media. And of course, it's all designed either to get Donald Trump elected or to fabricate the situation in Syria. Of course, there is the fog of war. And of course, truth is a casualty of war. Maybe its first casualty, as the old cliche goes. But this has actually become quite a big international industry, and it really should make everyone pause and think before they are doing something on social media with a graphic image that, in fact, could be easily manipulated. The tail wagging the dog, so to speak.
Indeed so. And, in fact, one must be extremely careful before one accepts these images and assumes that any image that comes out, whether of Aleppo or anywhere else in Syria, is in fact what it appears to be, because we have now found out about this one factory that produced these fabricated images in Egypt. Who knows how many others there are in various parts of the Arab world, particularly parts of the Arab world where there is support for the armed opposition in Syria. So there might be a very considerable production of these images, and of course there may be a considerable production of these images in Syria itself. I was reading a very interesting article by Patrick Coburn, who is a very well-known British journalist in the Middle East, and he made the point that many of the films and pictures that have allegedly come out of Aleppo, they never show armed militiamen there, even though they're supposed to be happening in a war zone. And he pointed out that we have no real knowledge of the provenance of these images, and there's every chance that they're being manipulated in the way that you've just said.
Another example that's become fairly well known, but perhaps not to the broader audience, because the broader audience isn't paying careful enough attention, nor could they really, to know all of this. But there's an image that has been shared thousands of times on Twitter and on Facebook with the caption, "Girl running to survive, all her family have been killed. It's not in Hollywood, this is real in Syria." But actually, it's from a Lebanese pop video. Is social media possibly a detriment now to getting facts? I mean, we've always thought about social media and the internet as the democratizing of the information flows because it's not coming simply by state government press agencies or by the mainstream corporate media, which in the case of the United States is a concentrated media authority. I mean, mainstream media is just a handful of American top transnational corporations. But in a way, when you think about social media under these circumstances, is it possibly a detriment to getting facts?
I think one must be careful about this because I think actually most people are skeptical about what they see on social media. I see sort of threads that appear on social media when people see these sort of things, and obviously some people are willing to be manipulated, but usually some people are quite skeptical. The bigger problem, in my opinion, is when the large media, the commercial media, the mainstream media, call it what you will, when it promotes these kind of stories, because it is the mainstream media that is creating the narrative, And it is by creating that narrative that these images, which appear on social media, gain credence. So if people read in the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Guardian or the Financial Times that these terrible things are happening in Aleppo, and they see a girl running with all her family killed, allegedly, in a video on social media, they're much more likely to believe it than if, of course, the media was telling the whole truth to the extent, of course, that it should be. In other words, if it was reporting the story properly. So I don't think we should blame social media. It is rather the sort of propaganda, if I can use that expression, that we have been seeing in mainstream media and the way it has been accepted there.
No, I think those are really important points for everyone to remember, because when you look at the issue of scale, who has the greatest impact and what media images and media stories have the greatest impact, it's not really fundamentally social media. It is the purveyors of mainstream media.
Exactly.
And when we look back even over not just even recent history, but like the last 100 years where the United States emerged as a global force with lots of interventions, you could go to the intervention in Cuba in 1898 and then the taking of the Philippines. That was because of the battleship Maine. Remember the Maine? And then
absolutely
the sinking of the Lusitania took a population that did not want to go into World War I. It took it into World War I. Then you had the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam, which turned out to be a false flag attack. The incubator babies in Iraq in 1990, where the U.S. government repeated what was said at the UN, which a report from what turned out to be a Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, that the Iraqi army was stealing little Kuwaiti babies out of their incubators to take incubators back to Baghdad. That is really all fake news. I mean, and it's a prerequisite to take populations to wars that they don't want to fight in.
It is entirely so. In fact, there's that famous quotation from the time of the Cuban War in the 1890s, in which the newspaper proprietor tells the reporter, you provide the story and I'll provide the war. And unfortunately, with mainstream media now having such vast reach through television, through radio, through printed media, through the internet, which it also, let us not forget, to a great extent dominates, it is very easy to manipulate images if people have the desire and will to do it. Now, the mainstream media, of course, projects itself as being this guardian of truth and objectivity, and this is where this whole fake news issue comes in. But, of course, if it itself, what it is actually doing, is protecting its own monopoly, which it is abusing, in order to promote fake news, what is actually fake news, then, of course, its attack on others who might be dissenting becomes frankly dangerous. And one always needs to understand that in fact, one shouldn't really blame social media, in my opinion. One should blame this very dangerous axis, if you will, between certain governments and certain big media agencies, which has become almost symbiotic.
We're speaking with Alexander Mercouris. He is the editor-in-chief of the Duran. We've been talking about the fake news, false images that have been created and used on social media to give people, well, just the wrong impression of what's going on. And we know that perhaps all sides would engage in propaganda because all sides really do want to have their side seem to be fighting the noble cause. That's kind of understandable. So a healthy degree of skepticism should be treated when we read any report or see any image. One of the things, though, that I think is that I want to focus on is that it's not just social media in general, and it's not just our need to be skeptical in general. We have, in the case of the United States mainstream media, a deafening roar, a hysterical presentation about the defeat of al-Nusra Front or the Army of Conquest, Al-Qaeda, in eastern Aleppo, and it's treated as one of the great, great crimes of modern times when the Syrian Arab Army, along with Iran and Hezbollah and with the support of Russia, drive organizations that the U.S. itself has declared to be terrorist out of East Aleppo, and that's considered to be like this terrible, nightmarish event. And all of the news and all of the media and all of the politicians from the United States, both parties and at the United Nations, are all about war crimes committed by Syria, not the terrorists. And then you have these social media images that seem to validate on the ground images that could not have been garnered otherwise by the mainstream media. There's another video called, and this has been running recently, executions have begun in the middle of the streets in Aleppo. That was when liberation was at hand. And it was shared all across social media. It says it depicts reality. The video dates back, though, from 2012 and contains unverified images. And yet we see mainstream media then going back and using social media reports like this false one as validation of the theme that has been adopted politically by the opinion molders.
Well, indeed so, because, of course, this is exactly what we talked about, that it's the narrative that is, in fact, the dominant narrative. And if we talk about what you describe about the Battle of Aleppo and the role of al-Nusra in it, of course, what very few people understand about this is who al-Nusra are, because, of course, it is never or very rarely explained to the Western media that al-Nusra is, in fact, the regional branch of al-Qaeda. And al-Qaeda is, of course, the organization that we declared the war on terror against, which has been waged disastrously for all these years, which led to an attack on Afghanistan with massive bombing there, which led to the opening of Guantanamo, and to the justification of all sorts of other horrors. Now, when this same organization is driven out of Aleppo, this is a disaster and a humanitarian catastrophe, and a huge market, as you correctly say, is then created for all these very manipulated images, some of them dating from 2012, which supposedly show what a kind of a disaster that is. Now, if the Western public were told who al-Nusra are and what is really been happening in Aleppo, then, of course, that industry of fake images would not exist, and we would be looking at an entirely different story. And it's very easy to see, actually, how in that kind of situation the whole public mood would completely change.
That's Alexander Mercouris. Alexander, also a good point that you're raising, and I think it's so lost on the mainstream media because if you keep saying the words like al-Nusra Front or the Army of Conquest, and it's unknown to the American population, they don't know who that means. But at the end of July, al-Qaeda, as you mentioned, the affiliate of al-Nusra Front, al-Qaeda's affiliate of the al-Nusra Front, actually renamed itself Fatah al-Sham Front and formally cut ties with al-Qaeda. But, and that's been reported in the media, but the move to cut its formal ties with al-Qaeda was approved by the al-Qaeda leadership, and they supported it. In other words, there was a deliberate effort for rebranding so that the United States government, this is my belief, so that the United States government, which has branded and told the American people al-Qaeda is existential terrorism, could resume its support or refuse to bomb their positions so that they could hold out in East Aleppo. But if you had called them al-Qaeda, naturally people would say, what? We're supporting al-Qaeda? So you just rebrand them. I mean, you can't get more cynical than that.
You cannot do so. And, of course, this is the whole problem, because what has happened is that all of these groups come up with this kaleidoscope of different names. They change their names regularly, precisely in order, I think, to confuse the Western public in exactly the way that you say. So if people in New York, who were the subject, whose city was the subject of the terrorist attacks in 2001, were aware of what was actually the actual people that we are supposedly defending in Aleppo and who've had this disastrous defeat inflicted upon them, if they knew about this, then obviously their whole view would change. So we have to have this extraordinary range of different names attached to them. We at the Duran, if I may say, we avoid this thing. We always refer to this organization, the people there, as al-Qaeda, because that is who they are. That is the name that they have given, and they have given themselves originally. That is the name they're known by, and we feel that that is the way to report the story truthfully. So we don't actually use these different names but of course the mainstream media does.
When you think about the propaganda effort to make al-Qaeda look like the suffering souls in East Aleppo rather than a terrorist organization, and when you think about all of the general sort of thumping for sympathy for them, and then we have incidents like what happened in Turkey, where Turkey, of course, played a big role in this kind of propaganda effort. But the Russian ambassador to Turkey was gunned down in cold blood, shot 11 times by a Turkish off-duty police officer who was shouting al-Nusra poems and rants and chants. I mean, we don't know exactly what happened there, what was behind it, or the motive, or whether he was just a lone sort of lunatic wolf. But nonetheless, when you create this kind of hysteria, it does have a deadly consequence.
It absolutely does, because, of course, it gives justification for that kind of violence. We don't know the motivations of this man. He may have been unbalanced. He may have been part of a larger group. Who knows? But the fact is that already there are some people, and it's very disturbing, in the United States and in various other places, who are justifying this action. I read a most disturbing article in a U.S. newspaper which called the murderer a soldier, and said that the ambassador who he had killed was a Russian soldier who had been involved in a war in which Russia has carried out atrocities, and has basically said that the murder was justified. Now, if the United States media is writing in that way, then of course what kind of effect is it going to have on suggestible people in places like Turkey or all sorts of other places who, of course, take their ideas from the media and promote them on social media and spread ideas like that? And, of course, it justifies violence and it justifies actions like the one we've just seen.
Okay, Alexander, we're out of time. We've been talking with Alexander Makuras. He is the editor-in-chief of the Duran. We will be back tomorrow. Be sure to go to our Facebook page, Loud and Clear with Brian Becker, for daily updates. If you enjoy the show and want your friends to hear it, let us know by liking the page on Facebook. Remember, telling the truth is important, but to make a difference, it has to be loud and clear. We are out of here.
Loud and Clear.